Hey, what's up everyone, GameDad here, coming at you guys with a new kind of video. Since I've gone through and I've done all my collection videos and showcased everything, I figured it'd be fun to kind of just put them all together into a series of compilation videos, going through all of those in case you didn't want to bounce around or anything like that. So, today we are taking a look at the Atari 2600 collection series that I did, and they are just kind of stitched together so that you guys can go through the entire collection in one fell swoop. So, come along as we check out all of the games that are in my Atari 2600 collection. Now this first game that I'm going to show you guys some footage of is Adventure. This is a classic on the Atari 2600. Now up next we have Adventures of Tron. This is one of those Atari 2600 games that has that kind of weird cartridge on it. Reminds me of an Intellivision. Now the next game up is Airlock. Now we're going to take a look at Air Raiders. Up next we have another classic Atari 2600 game, and that is Asteroids. Now here we have a variation of Asteroids from Mattel games with hyperspace and thrust control. Up next we have Astro Blast. Now here we have a game from Imagic, or Imagic, however you pronounce it, called Atlantis. Now the next cartridge I have is Basic Programming, and I actually have the keyboard controllers that come with this. Up next is a classic sports title, Basketball. Up next we have Berserk. Now this was one of the first games to have actual voice modulation in it. Now we have Big Bird's Egg Catch for the Atari 2600. Now for those people that want to get their gambling on, here is Blackjack. Now here's another game that uses the Atari keyboard controllers, that is Brain Games. Next up we have Breakout, excellent game for use with the paddle controllers. Now here we have Canyon Bomber. Now here we have Carnival by Sega. Now again for the gamblers out there we have Casino. And right here we have Centipede, one of the all-time favorites for many people out there. Here is my copy of Circus Atari. Now here's one of my favorite games on the Atari, and that is Combat. Now up next we have Commando Raid. Here's another fun game on the Atari, that is Concentration. Now here is another one of my Imagic games, and that is Cosmic Arc. Up next we have Cruise Missile. Now here is a great game, that is Crystal Castles. Now moving on, we have Dark Cavern, and here we have a game with 6 levels of play. We have Deadly Duck. Another classic Atari game, classic arcade, that is Defender. Another Imagic game, we have Demon Attack. Continuing with that demon theme, we have Demons to Diamonds. Now for the last one in this video, we have another one of my favorite franchises of the old retro games, and that is Dig Dug. Now what Atari collection would be complete without having Donkey Kong by Nintendo on the Atari? Up first we have Dolphin, released in 1983 by Activision. Now in this game you play as a dolphin that is trying to outrun an octopus. Now I found the barriers a little bit annoying in this game, but overall I had a good time. I thought this game was pretty fun. Up next we have Donkey Kong Jr., originally released in 1981 by Nintendo of America. The Atari 2600 version was released in 1983 by Coleco Industries, and considering the hardware it was running on, it's actually a pretty decent port. Next we have Dragster, released in 1980 by Activision. Now this game has been a topic of conversation in recent months due to Todd Rogers having his world record score of 5.51 removed due to it being an impossibility within the game. Here we have Enduro, released in 1983 by Activision. In this classic racing game, you have to dodge other vehicles while driving down the road at breakneck speeds. This game reminds me of an early version of Outrun. Released in 1982 by Fox Video Games, Fantastic Voyage is a space adventure style game where you must avoid the walls and projectiles in your path along the way to the finish. Released in 1982 by Imagic, Firefighter is a fun little game where you play as a lone firefighter trying to put out a building fire in order to save the people inside. Firefly was released in 1983 by Mythicon. In this Space Invader style game, you actually take a side-scrolling approach to the genre to continue through the game and reach the end. Released in 1988 by Atari, Football is more accurately a soccer-style game. You play the game as part of a 3-person team going head-to-head with the opposing team until the time runs out. Frankenstein's Monster was released in 1983 by Data Age. In this game, you have to traverse through the floors of the castle to collect the items necessary to complete the stage. In 1981, Activision released Freeway. In this Frogger-style game, you must move your character to the other side of the freeway without getting hit by the oncoming traffic that is moving at various speeds. Next up is Frontline, released in 1982 by Taito. In this military-style shooter game, you must start out by traversing through the jungle and defeating enemies coming at you from all sides. Next is another space shooter that reminds me of Space Invaders with more colors. Released in 1983 by Bally Midway, Galaxian is another fun arcade port addition to my Atari 2600 collection. Up next is Grand Prix. This Enduro meets Dragster crossover was released in 1982 by Activision and was a lot of fun to capture footage for. I found myself trying over and over to get a higher score and just get a little bit further in the game. Now here we have Haunted House, released by Atari in 1981. In this game, you play as a set of eyes that is wandering around in the dark looking for clues and trying to avoid enemies. While frustrating at times, I found this game to actually be quite entertaining. Up next is Home Run, released by Atari in 1978. Unfortunately, this was a title that, while playable on my Atari 2600, did not appear to work on my Retron 77. Next up is Human Cannonball. Released by Atari in 1979, you play as the operator of a large cannon that is going to shoot a person out of the barrel. You must find the right angle to match with the wind speed so that you can get the person to safely land in the net on the other side of the screen. Released in 1981 by Activision, ice hockey is a 2-on-2 matchup on the ice. Depending on where the puck is, you will either be playing as the goalie or trying to score on your opponent. Although it took me a few tries, I had a lot of fun once I had it figured out. Next up is Journey Escape, released by Data Age in 1982. In this game, you play as a small character trying to navigate your way through a maze of enemies that keep spawning to block your path. I wasn't actually a huge fan of this game as it felt pretty monotonous. Next is an absolute classic. Released by Williams in 1982, Joust is one of my favorite games from this era. The concept alone is something that would draw people in. How the creators thought of knights riding ostriches while jousting is beyond me, but it somehow works. Next is another Pac-Man clone. Junior Pac-Man was released in 1986 by Bally Midway. While I can honestly say it played a lot better than the normal Pac-Man game on the 2600, it just didn't do it for me. I'll take the arcade Pac-Man any day over the 2600 versions. Here we have Jungle Hunt. This game was released in 1982 by Taito and reminds me very much of Pitfall with its vine swinging and jungle running. I actually had a lot of fun with this game. It has light gameplay and fun colors. Before I knew it, I was already playing this game for over an hour. Being a martial artist myself, I had to have karate in my collection. Released in 1982 by Froggo Games, in this game you spar with an opponent using strikes and kicks to earn points. While the realism was obviously lacking, it was still a fun game to play. Next is Laser Blast, which was released by Activision in 1981. Unfortunately, this was another title that my Retron 77 was just unable to capture footage for. Next is Lock and Chase, released by Data East in 1982. In this Pac-Man clone, you have to run around collecting everything while avoiding the police. Once you collect everything, the door will unlock and you will be able to move on to the next level. Next up is Mad by the US Games Corporation, which was released in 1982. In this game, which reminded me a lot of Atlantis, you are trying to shoot down enemies and prevent them from bombing your bases and taking out your own weapons. Next up is another classic arcade port. Mario Bros. Was released for the Atari 2600 by Nintendo in 1983. In this game, you take out enemies by hitting the ground beneath them, then kicking them off the screen and collecting their coins. Next up is MASH, released in 1983 by Fox Video Games. In this game, you start out by piloting a helicopter and trying to get people safely back to your base. This game to me felt like a different approach to a choplifter style game. Next is Maze Craze, released by Atari in 1978. In this game, you and another player go head to head as you try to get through the maze before the other player does. I had a lot of fun playing through this game because it reminded me of doing mazes as a kid. Next up is Megaforce. This game was released by Fox Video Games in 1982. In Megaforce, you are piloting a plane that is bombing and avoiding enemies. I actually found this game to be quite challenging and found myself getting shot down quite a bit. Next up is Midnight Magic by Broderbund Software that was released in 1982. This game is a great pinball board for the Atari 2600. It admittedly took me a minute to figure out how to launch the ball, but once I got going, I really enjoyed the game. Up next is Miniature Golf, released in 1978 by Atari. This is the last game in this video that I was unfortunately unable to capture footage for. It is quite a fun game though. Up next is another absolute classic released by Atari in 1981. This is Missile Command. In this game, you must quickly launch countermeasures to defend against an incoming barrage of missiles. To add to the challenge, you can only have 2 countermeasures on screen at once. Released in 1983 by Atari, Moon Patrol is a side-scrolling shooter where you pilot a vehicle that has the ability to jump on command. Mountain King was released by CBS Toys in 1983. Unfortunately, this was one of a few games in this video where my Retron 77 couldn't capture the footage. Mousetrap is a Pac-Man style clone released in 1981 by Exidy Incorporated. This game is very simple in concept. You are the mouse, don't get caught by the cats. Released for the 2600 by Atari in 1982, Ms. Pac-Man takes a lot of what was wrong with the Pac-Man port and makes it much better. While still not as good as the arcade version, this is a pretty good port. In Night Driver, released in 1978 by Atari, you race on a black track to simulate nighttime driving. I found this game to actually be pretty fast-paced and hard to control at times. Omega Race was released in 1981 by Bally Midway and is unfortunately another game that the Retron 77 was unable to load. Othello was released in 1980 by Atari and is a puzzle-based game where you must place light or dark pieces while trying to capture the other player's pieces for your own. Outlaw was released by Atari in 1978 and is a one-on-one shootout style game. Players must shoot the player on the other side of the screen before getting shot themselves. Although Pac-Man, released for the 2600 by Atari in 1981, is an absolutely iconic arcade game, this port, in my opinion, leaves a lot to be desired. The port is buggy and is graphically subpar, but at least you got Pac-Man at home, right? In Pele's Soccer, released in 1981 by Atari, you play a 3-on-3 game of soccer where the player controls the entire team at once. The concept behind this was a little strange at first, but I actually ended up liking how it played. Pengo is a fun little Sega game that was licensed for the 2600 by Atari in 1984. In the game, you play as a penguin either breaking or moving blocks of ice around to defeat the enemies on the screen. Pitfall is another classic released by Activision in 1982. With the ability to go above or below ground, jump obstacles, and swing from vines, it's no wonder that this game was such a huge hit. With Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns, released by Activision in 1982, being a fun follow-up to the first Pitfall game, I was bummed to see that the Retron 77 wasn't able to play the game. Planet Patrol was released by Spectravideo International in 1983 and plays a lot like Defender in the sense that you can travel back and forth as you take out enemies and avoid obstacles. Here is another arcade port from the 2600 era. Popeye, released by Nintendo in 1983, is yet another game that my Retron 77 was unable to capture footage for. This is an actual arcade machine I would love to own someday. Until then, I'll just stick with the ones that I have. Q*bert is a great platformer/puzzle game that was released by Parker Brothers in 1983. In this game, you play as a small creature that is trying to light up all of the tiles on the screen while avoiding the enemies. Next up is Race, released in 1977 by Atari. This is probably one of my oldest games in my collection. This game is actually a lot of fun and is one of my only 2600 games that supports the driving controller. Raiders of the Lost Ark for the 2600 was released by Atari in 1982. I must admit I didn't really understand what was happening in the game and had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to proceed past the first screen. Now this game I had a lot of fun with. RealSports Boxing, released by Atari in 1987, was colorful and fast-paced. I had a blast moving around the ring and throwing punches every chance I got. Super fun game. Another RealSports game, Football, was released by Atari in 1982 and has a much more realistic look and feel than other sports games from this same era. With a full field of play and multiple team members on the field, it was a lot of fun to play. My last 2600 RealSports game is Tennis. This game was released in 1983 by Atari, and it shows. This is when these games started becoming more colorful and fast-paced. With a 3D-like playfield, it felt very realistic for the time period that it was released. Next up is another game from Imagic. Riddle of the Sphinx was released in 1982 and is actually a pretty fun puzzle adventure game. It's colorful and has a decent amount going on. I wish the sprites had a little more to their movement, but it was good. River Raid was released by Activision in 1982 and is another great example of what that company was capable of. This vertical scrolling shoot 'em up is a lot of fun and has an interesting fuel mechanic that has you constantly having to shoot fuel tanks on screen to stay airborne. Activision released Seaquest in 1983 and I've got to say, it's pretty fun. You play as a submarine that is rescuing divers while avoiding obstacles like sharks, all while monitoring oxygen levels. Skiing was released by Activision in 1980 and is another game in this video that the Retron 77 couldn't play. I'm not sure why it has issues with some games and not others, but at least the majority of my collection could be captured, which is still awesome. Skydiver was released in 1979 by Atari and the game is just that, skydiving. You base when you will jump off of the windsock blowing at the bottom of the screen. You then launch the skydiver to get them to land on the pad at the bottom. Released in 1978 by Atari, Slot Racers was actually made by Warren Robinette, who later made Adventure, the first game to ever have an Easter egg hidden in it. Sneak and Peek, released by the U.S. Games Corporation in 1982, is literally a game of hide and seek. I thought this was a pretty cool idea to put into a video game. I don't think I've ever seen something like this anywhere else. In Sorcerer, released by Mythicon in 1983, you play as just that, a sorcerer. From what I can tell, your character is riding a magic carpet while side-scrolling through levels and avoiding obstacles and enemies in his path. Space Attack was released by Mattel in 1982 and was actually pretty difficult for me to find info on. I didn't really understand the gameplay, unfortunately, so who knows. It could have been fun, and I just didn't know how to take advantage of that. Odds are, if you had a 2600, you had Space Invaders. Released by Atari in 1978, this classic arcade port, while not as visually appealing, is still a lot of fun. I had a blast taking out wave after wave of aliens. Space Jockey was released in 1982 by the U.S. Games Corporation and is the last game in this video that the Retron 77 was unable to run. Hopefully moving forward, Hyperkin can patch the system to allow it to work with more of the 2600 library, but until then, I'll just stick to my 2600 to play this one. The last game for this video is Space War. This game was released by Atari in 1978 and has a very Asteroids feel to it, just without the asteroids. You play as a small ship that is flying around trying to take out the other player on the screen while firing a weapon that seems to bounce around the screen. Spider-Man was released for the 2600 in 1982 by Parker Brothers. I found this game to be a bit challenging because the physics of the web attaching to the building can be quite temperamental. In Squeezebox, released by the U.S. Games Corporation in 1982, you play as a character that has to shoot the walls that keep closing in. This was a pretty fun and frantic game to play. In Stampede, released by Activision in 1981, you are off to the farm where you race around throwing your lasso to catch cattle. While very simple, this game was also a lot of fun. Now, when I first picked up Star Fox, released in 1983 by Mythicon, I instantly thought of the Nintendo version. This is not that. You fly around and shoot stuff. Okay, maybe not that different than Nintendo. Released by Activision in 1982, in Starmaster, you fly around space in a first-person perspective. At least, that's all I could get the game to do. There must be more to it with it being an Activision game. Star Raiders was released by Atari in 1982 and is a strange grid-based space game. I didn't really understand what was happening in it though. I guess that's where the manual would have been helpful. Released by Atari in 1977, Starship was actually one of the first 9 launch titles for the Atari 2600. Unfortunately, this is another game on my list that the Retron 77 just couldn't play. Star Trek, released by Sega in 1983, takes an interesting approach to the way the game is laid out with information being displayed everywhere. In the upper right, you see your relative location, and on the bottom you can fire at enemies. I thought this game was actually pretty fun. Star Voyager was released in 1982 by Imagic. In this game, you navigate through space while destroying enemies that cross your path. Published by Parker Brothers in 1982, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back was the first licensed Star Wars video game to ever be released. The following year, it was also released on the Intellivision. Released in 1980 by Atari, Steeplechase is a horse racing game where you must consistently jump over and avoid hurdles. Very simple gameplay, but extremely addicting. Street Racer was released by Atari in 1978 and is a top-down style racing game where it looks like you are racing Indy cars through the streets. Released by EPYX in 1987, Summer Games takes you to the Summer Olympics where you face off against various countries. The first event I played was the long jump. It did not go well. Released by Atari in 1979, Superman is one of those games that you would think would be awesome because of its subject matter. It's not. The gameplay was very sporadic, and there was no clear goal as to what needed to be done. Super Breakout was released by Atari in 1979, and I have to say, this game is awesome. I've always loved Breakout-style games, and this is one from the very beginning. Super Challenge Baseball was released by Mattel in 1982 along with several other games as ports from the Intellivision. This is a very simple isometric baseball game, but it gets the job done. Super Challenge Football is another game released in 1982 by Mattel. Just like the previous game, it was originally released on the Intellivision and then ported over to the Atari 2600. Being another one of the 9 original launch titles for the 2600, Surround was released by Atari in 1977. Unfortunately, again, this is a game that does not work with the Retron 77. Towering Inferno was released in 1982 by the US Games Corporation and is a lot like Firefighter meets Pac-Man in my opinion. You run around putting out fires while also dodging other fires so that you don't get burned. Track and Field was released by Atari in 1984. This game has multiple events and starts you off with a long jump. Again, I did not do well. TRON Deadly Discs was released in 1982 by Mattel and is a fun shooter-style game where you have to throw discs at doorways and enemies while using the environment to your advantage. Released in 1983 by CBS Toys, Tunnel Runner is one of a few different games released under the RAM Plus banner because the games had an additional 256 bytes of RAM in them. Unfortunately, my Retron 77 is unable to play games like this, but at least I got the title screen for it to load. Turmoil was released by Fox Video Games in 1982 and is a shooter where you have to move up and down while shooting left or right to get all of the objects and enemies as they pass by. Vanguard was released by Atari in 1988 and is probably the latest release Atari 2600 game that I currently own. This game is a side-scrolling shooter that also gives you the ability to shoot above or below your ship. Video Chess by Atari was released in 1978 and is just that, video chess. The graphics for the game do their job in identifying pieces and it plays pretty smoothly. Not a bad game if you're down for some chess. This is the last game I currently have of the original launch titles for the Atari 2600 and that is Video Olympics, released by Atari in 1977. This is also the last game of this video that I was unable to capture footage for with my Retron 77. Video Pinball was released by Atari in 1981 and is a very fun but simple pinball game. The physics aren't half bad, and the game does what it is designed to do. Warlords was released by Atari in 1981 and is a fun multiplayer game that has each player taking control of their area in a game of offense and defense. You must take out your enemies while also defending your base. Wizard of War was released by CBS Toys in 1981. This game is definitely another Pac-Man style clone game. It has dragons and a wizard, but it's a clone game. Arguably one of the best games for the Atari 2600, Yar's Revenge was released by Atari in 1981. This game was created by none other than Howard Scott Warshaw, who coincidentally also made arguably one of the worst games on the 2600, E.T. And there you have it, everyone. That is every single game that is currently in my Atari 2600 collection. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this compilation. I will be doing a few more of these, going through all the consoles as a whole. So in order to get an alert about that whenever it comes out, be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, as well as that little notification bell. Now, as always, I'm GameDad. I thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you later.